The rain had been falling for 3 days when the boy appeared at the gates of St. Augustine's Home for Boys. Sister Margaret found him at dawn on October 14th, 1952, standing motionless beneath the iron archway, rain streaming from his too large coat onto shoes held together with twine. Most children arrived crying. This one simply watched the building with pale gray eyes that seemed to count the windows. Sister Margaret brought him inside, sat him in the kitchen with a bowl of chicken soup, and asked his name while water pooled beneath his chair. "David Rosewood," he said, 9 years old, parents dead in a house fire in Wheeling, West Virginia. No relatives willing to take him. The story was common enough in 1952. Sister Margaret had heard variations of it dozens of times since the war ended. She filled out the intake forms, gave him donated clothes that almost fit, and assigned him a bed in the junior dormitory. Father Thomas Byrne conducted the standard interview the next morning. In 6 years as director, he had developed an instinct for reading children. This one was different. The boy sat with perfect posture, hands folded, and recited his story with the precision of someone reading from a script he had memorized. The details were all present: the kitchen fire, his mother's screams, his father's failed attempt to fight the flames, but delivered without the fractured quality of genuine trauma. Father Byron approved the admission and made a note in the file: "This child bears watching." 3 weeks later, the incident with Marcus Webb changed everything. Marcus was 14, large for his age, and had controlled the dormitory's social hierarchy for 2 years through carefully calibrated violence. New boys learned quickly to show appropriate deference. When David Rosewood continued reading during Marcus's introduction to the tribute system, the outcome seemed inevitable. Marcus grabbed the book, a biography of Houdini from Father Byron's library, and threw it against the wall. David watched its trajectory, then returned his gaze to Marcus without speaking. The beating was brief. 3 strikes: stomach, ribs, face. David absorbed each blow without sound or resistance, his expression unchanging. Then he spoke for the first time since Marcus had approached. "Peter must miss writing to you. Your brother. In Richmond, with your uncle, the one who uses a belt. It would be unfortunate if Father Byrne learned why Peter's letters sometimes have tear stains on them." The specificity froze Marcus mid-motion. David had been at St. Augustine's for 21 days. He had never been observed speaking to Marcus or showing interest in the older boy's affairs. Yet somehow, he knew about the brother Marcus protected, the abusive uncle, the coded pleas for help in carefully censored letters. Marcus demanded to know how David had learned this. David explained in the same flat tone he had used to describe his parents' death. He had observed the letters arriving on a regular schedule. He had noted Marcus's unusual care with these particular possessions. He had overheard a conversation between Marcus and Father Byron that mentioned Peter's name and location. The rest was simple deduction based on behavioral patterns. What he did not explain was how he had identified Marcus's deepest source of guilt within 3 weeks, or why he had cataloged that information for exactly this purpose. Marcus left without another word. His followers looked confused, uncertain whether their leader had won or lost. The dormitory understood that something had shifted, though most boys could not articulate what. Dr. Eleanor Marsh arrived at St. Augustine's the following week. She introduced herself as a psychologist from Georgetown University, conducting research on childhood trauma and resilience. Her study was funded by a federal educational initiative that she declined to specify further. Father Byron welcomed the research. Sister Margaret mentioned David Rosewood as a potentially interesting case, the boy who had been beaten but showed no emotional response, who had somehow obtained detailed personal information about another resident through methods no one could explain. Dr. Marsh requested an interview. David was brought to the small meeting room where social workers conducted their assessments. He sat in the wooden chair across from her, hands folded, and answered every question with measured precision. Yes, the beating had hurt, but pain was temporary. No, he was not afraid of Marcus. Yes, he understood that his comments might have seemed threatening, but he had simply been sharing relevant information. Dr. Marsh had conducted hundreds of these interviews. She recognized the performance. 20 minutes in, she violated her standard protocol. She told David directly that she did not believe his parents had died in a fire. She did not believe his name was Rosewood. She did not believe any of his biographical information. David smiled. It was not a child's smile. He acknowledged her accuracy. The fire was fiction. The name was borrowed from a tombstone in a cemetery outside Harrisburg. The biographical details were constructed from observation of how other orphans described their circumstances. Dr. Marsh asked, why? David considered the question with unusual care. People were more comfortable with familiar narratives, he explained. A boy orphaned by fire was sympathetic. A boy with no verifiable past was concerning. He had provided the story people needed to accept his presence without asking questions he preferred not to answer. She pressed for truth. David said his earliest memories were of institutions and foster homes in Pennsylvania, possibly Ohio. He had learned early that providing expected answers was more efficient than literal honesty. He had refined these techniques over time. He had come to St. Augustine's because he needed a new environment. The orphanage provided shelter and opportunities to observe human behavior in controlled conditions. He would remain until the environment stopped offering useful information. Dr. Marsh asked what information he sought. How people worked, David said. What made them trust, fear, obey. Why they behaved irrationally, acting against self-interest based on emotions that overrode logic. He wanted to understand the systems governing human interaction. The interview lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Dr. Marsh had 17 pages of notes documenting the most extraordinary profile she had encountered in 15 years of clinical practice. Her report to the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's predecessor, still operating certain programs under legacy authorization, was filed 3 days later through classified channels. The relevant section was brief. Subject displays severe antisocial characteristics combined with exceptional intelligence and self-awareness. Natural ability to construct false identities and manipulate social situations. Complete emotional control. Conscious strategic thinking about exploiting psychological advantages. Recommend immediate transfer to specialized assessment program. If we do not secure this asset, his unsupervised development poses significant risk. Approval came within a week. The cover story was arranged efficiently. A distant relative had been located, willing to provide a permanent home. Father Byron was relieved. Sister Margaret was simply glad to see the boy go, though something about his departure felt wrong. David packed his few possessions without comment. He said polite goodbyes to staff members and climbed into the black Chevrolet Style line that arrived on January 8, 1953. As the car pulled away, he looked back once at the building. Dr. Marsh, watching from a second-floor window, saw something in that glance that would haunt her for decades. David was not looking back with nostalgia. He was cataloging final details, filing information about the institution and its inhabitants for possible future use. St. Augustine's had been a laboratory. Now he was moving to a more sophisticated one. The car turned south on Route 1, heading toward Maryland. In the back seat, David Rosewood, or whatever his real name was, sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, watching the Virginia countryside pass by. In his coat pocket was a small notebook he had kept hidden during his months at the orphanage. The pages contained observations written in a cipher of his own invention, detailed notes on which emotional displays produced which responses from authority figures, which behaviors triggered suspicion versus sympathy, which lies were most readily believed. The final entry, made that morning, consisted of 3 words: mission accomplished. Next phase. The file on David Rosewood's time at St. Augustine's Home for Boys would remain sealed in CIA archives until 2023. The only public record was a single line in the orphanage ledger. David Rosewood, age 9, admitted October 1952, placed with family January 1953. 70 years later, when the files were finally declassified, a researcher would notice something odd about the dates. David had claimed to arrive after his parents' death in a fire in Wheeling, West Virginia. But records showed no such fire had occurred in Wheeling in 1952 or in the 5 years preceding his arrival. The researcher would spend 6 months trying to identify David's true origins. She would find no birth certificate, no school records, no hospital admissions, no documentation of any kind proving that a child named David Rosewood had existed before October 1952. It was as if he had materialized from nothing, already fully formed, already capable of deception that fooled everyone except the one person trained to recognize it. And even Dr. Eleanor Marsh had not truly understood what she had found until it was far too late. The facility had no name on any map. Local residents in Garrett County, Maryland, knew it only as the school, though no children from neighboring farms attended classes there. 140 acres of forest, surrounded by chain-link fence that seemed excessive for education. A single road connected the compound to Route 135, monitored by a guardhouse that turned away anyone lacking authorization. The sign read, Chesapeake Educational Research Institute, private property. David arrived on a gray January afternoon in 1953. The Chevrolet Style line passed through 2 checkpoints before stopping at a converted hunting lodge. Dr. Marsh emerged, accompanied by a man in a loose wool suit who carried himself with unmistakable military precision. Colonel James Whitmore, 47, OSS veteran, officer responsible for Project Mockingbird's security. He outlined the structure during their walk inside. 12 children, ages 8 to 14, selected for specific aptitudes. Classes 6 days weekly. Physical training each morning. Cooperation expected. Violence prohibited. Attempts to leave would result in termination and return to institutional care. Not return to St. Augustine's. Just institutional care. David noted the phrasing. His room was small. Bed, desk, chair, footlocker. The window overlooked forest, but the glass was reinforced and the frame bolted. The door locked from outside. Dr. Marsh waited until Whitmore left. This was an opportunity, she said. The children here were special. The training would help him develop capabilities that served important purposes. David asked what purposes. National security, she said. The Cold War required new approaches. People with unique psychological profiles could accomplish things traditional operatives could not. She was lying, but not entirely. David cataloged the tells. Hesitation before national security. Elevated pitch on protecting American interests. He asked if he could refuse. Her micro-expression of discomfort lasted half a second. Technically, yes, she said, but refusal meant return to the orphanage system, which would investigate why the placement failed. Questions about his background. Questions he preferred to avoid. The threat was clear. They knew his identity wouldn't withstand scrutiny. He asked when classes began. Tomorrow, she said. The relief in her voice was genuine. 12 pairs of eyes evaluated David during dinner, each gaze calculating in ways ordinary children's would not be. Catherine Ross, 14, sat at the far end watching him with clinical interest. Next to her, twins Marcus and Michael Porter, 12, identically featured but with subtly different body language. The youngest, Thomas Chen, 8, glanced up briefly, then returned to his food with practiced disinterest. No one spoke. A woman supervised from the doorway but didn't interact beyond ensuring they cleared their plates. The silence felt structured, as if conversation had been trained out of them. After dinner, Catherine approached. Tall, dark hair cut short, eyes that blinked at irregular intervals. She explained the real rules. Morning exercises tested compliance, not athletic ability. Classes were individual. No one knew what others learned. Violence was prohibited, but psychological manipulation was tacitly encouraged if it left no evidence. David asked why she was sharing this. Because everyone tries to figure out the power structure, she said. This saves time. She'd been here longest, 2 years. She knew the boundaries. Then she asked what David had done to get noticed. David listened without responding. She was probing while pretending to offer information. Transparent. Catherine smiled at his silence. Genuine curiosity replacing calculation. She'd killed her stepfather at 12 and convinced police it was self-defense. Which it was, but she'd engineered the circumstances requiring lethal force. Marcus and Michael had run a Chicago fraud operation that netted $40,000 before they were caught. Thomas tested at IQ 187 and showed no emotional attachment to anyone, including his parents. David asked what they were being trained for. Official answer: intelligence analysis and psychological operations. Actual answer: more complex. Some learned cryptography. Others, interrogation resistance. A few, like Catherine, studied social engineering, systematic manipulation of human behavior. The curriculum was too refined to be experimental, Catherine said. Someone had been teaching children to deceive for years, possibly decades, under classification that kept it invisible. David asked if anyone had tried to escape. Catherine's smile darkened. 2 had tried. Both were found within hours. Both were gone now, transferred or erased from records as failed experiments. The message was clear. Escape was possible but futile. David's first class began at 800. The instructor, Mrs. Webb, was 50-ish with gray hair and a tight bun and hands that trembled slightly. Early Parkinson's, David noted, probably 5 to 7 years from severe disability. The room contained a table, 2 chairs, and a reel-to-reel recorder. They would practice conversation exercises, she explained, creating believable false narratives that withstood scrutiny. She began simply, pretend to be a Washington, D.C. high school student. David constructed a complete identity, sophomore at Woodrow Wilson, chess club member, living with an aunt in Georgetown while parents worked overseas. Mrs. Webb's questions probed for inconsistencies. What did he eat Tuesday? Who sat next to him in chemistry? What color was the principal's tie last week? David maintained the narrative flawlessly, inventing details that fit the framework. When she caught a discrepancy, Woodrow Wilson had no second-floor chemistry lab. He smoothly corrected. He'd misspoken. The lab was in the basement. He'd been thinking of second-floor biology. The pattern repeated daily. Each session introduced new complexity. Posing as a journalist, foreign student, constructing alibis. Mrs. Webb taught specific techniques, anchoring false memories to real experiences, using precise details to overwhelm skepticism, managing cognitive load by keeping lies close to truth. David absorbed the instruction, but he also noticed what the instructors apparently didn't. The training taught him to deceive not just targets, but also his trainers. 6 weeks in, David joined Colonel Whitmore's advanced seminar. Only 4 attended: David, Catherine, and the Porter twins. This classroom contained maps, photographs, technical equipment suggesting operational rather than theoretical training. Whitmore presented scenarios from actual intelligence operations, cases where psychological manipulation had succeeded or failed. A blown Prague network because an operative showed inappropriate emotional attachment. A successful Berlin disinformation campaign exploiting a Soviet officer's gambling addiction. A failed Cairo assassination when the target's psychological profile proved inaccurate. These were after-action reports from genuine operations, David recognized. Classified details removed, but tactical lessons retained. During the 4th session, Whitmore described infiltrating a target organization using an asset so young that normal security wouldn't identify the threat. The asset would require years of preparation, complete psychological control, ability to maintain deep cover without supervision. He asked the class to identify primary challenges. Catherine suggested children lacked emotional stability for long-term deception. The Porters argued youth was actually an advantage. Targets would underestimate the threat. Thomas pointed out the asset would age into adulthood, requiring transition strategies most services had no framework for. David offered different analysis. The primary challenge wasn't the child's capability, but the handler's comfort with the concept. Adults had psychological resistance to viewing children as operational assets rather than victims. Intelligence services would unconsciously sabotage their own programs through inappropriate emotional attachment or ethical hesitation. The room fell silent. Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but David detected recognition, slight tightening around the eyes. The colonel asked him to elaborate. David explained the scenario was probably not hypothetical. Mockingbird existed because someone recognized certain psychological profiles became visible in childhood and early recruitment allowed thorough training. But the program likely faced constant challenges from oversight, uncomfortable with deploying child assets regardless of capability. This created a paradox. Demonstrate value to justify existence, but demonstration required deployment that organizational culture resisted. The solution was focusing on children whose profiles suggested they'd eventually serve intelligence purposes regardless of training. Sociopaths who would become assets or threats whether recruited or not. By framing recruitment as harm reduction rather than exploitation, Whitmore said quietly, the program becomes defensible. Exactly, David confirmed. Catherine stared at him with undisguised fascination. The porters exchanged glances, recalibrating their assessment. Thomas's stillness seemed more attentive. Whitmore concluded without comment. As students filed out, he asked David to remain. The colonel waited until they were alone. He asked how long David had understood Mockingbird's true nature. David considered lying, decided truth was strategically valuable. From the first day, he said. The training was too operational for pure research. Dr. Marsh's discomfort suggested ethical conflict. The security was excessive for study but appropriate for operational training. Conclusion: CIA was developing child assets for contexts where adults would be ineffective. The academic framing was cover. Whitmore asked if this bothered him. No, David said. Morality was a social construct facilitating cooperation among individuals with conflicting interests. He understood its utility but didn't experience it as internal constraint. Whether the program was ethical was irrelevant to whether it was effective. The colonel studied him. Then he said 3 types ended up in intelligence work. First, believed in protecting their country, accepted moral complexity as necessary cost. Second, were damaged individuals seeking purpose or power. Third were people like David, those who viewed the enterprise as intellectual exercise with no emotional stakes. The first type burned out. The second became liabilities when psychological needs conflicted with operations. The third were most valuable and most dangerous because they had no natural limit. Whitmore had worked with perhaps a dozen in the third category. Most ended badly. Suicide, defection, collapse, when detachment finally failed. A few became legends, accomplishing impossible things because they could do what others couldn't. He told David he'd almost certainly become one or the other. David asked if that meant removal from the program. Whitmore smiled. Rare expression that made him look older, tired. No, he said. It meant acknowledging the program had already lost control of David, if it ever had control. The next years wouldn't be about training him. They'd be about discovering what David chose to become when given tools and opportunity. David returned to his room that evening and opened his hidden notebook. He added a new section, long-term strategy. The entries outlined a plan requiring years. By the time anyone realized what he was building, it would be too late. 3 months into David's residency, Mrs. Webb collapsed during a session with another child. Right side paralyzed, unable to speak. Medical personnel arrived within minutes. The facility maintained full infirmary, but damage was catastrophic. She died 48 hours later without regaining consciousness. Official cause: cerebrovascular accident, consistent with age and Parkinson's. Autopsy showed nothing suspicious. Burst aneurysm in middle cerebral artery, spontaneous medical event. Only Dr. Marsh noticed the pattern. Mrs. Webb was the 4th staff member to die or suffer severe crisis since Mockingbird's inception 3 years earlier. Previous 3, security officer, administrative assistant, instructor, all experienced sudden cardiac events or strokes despite relative youth and health. Statistical probability of 4 such incidents in a facility housing fewer than 30 people. Approximately 1 in 8,700. She brought concerns to Whitmore privately. He listened, then asked whether she believed the deaths were deliberate, and if so, by whom. Dr. Marsh had no evidence. Autopsies showed natural causes. No poisoning, no suspicious circumstances, no witnesses. But the pattern troubled her, especially given the children's profiles. Whitmore was silent nearly a minute. Then he said something that would haunt her. If a child had developed capability to cause deaths appearing natural, logical response would be identifying and stopping them. But the program's purpose was developing exactly such capabilities. Stopping a child who successfully demonstrated lethal skills would contradict the fundamental objective. Mockingbird couldn't simultaneously train children to kill without detection and punish them for practicing on available targets. Dr. Marsh asked if he was suggesting they allow potential murders to continue. Without evidence, accusations were baseless, Whitmore said. Increased medical screening might be prudent. Children should be observed more carefully. But if a child had achieved the capability they were witnessing, that child was already beyond control. Confrontation would accelerate whatever agenda they were pursuing. Better to watch, wait, document. Learn from observing a developing predator in controlled conditions. The intelligence value might outweigh the cost. Dr. Marsh left feeling physically ill. That night she began a separate journal, personal record of her growing conviction that Mockingbird represented something fundamentally wrong. The final entry, written 3 years later, would be one sentence. We have created something we cannot contain, and we have done so deliberately. But in spring 1953, she still believed observation might prevent the worst outcomes. She was wrong. David Rosewood was already beyond understanding and just beginning to discover what he could become. In his room that night, he reviewed what he'd learned from Mrs. Webb before her death. The stroke had been convenient, eliminating an instructor who'd begun noticing inconsistencies in his performance, who'd started asking questions about the gap between his stated capabilities and actual knowledge. The technique had worked perfectly. Elevated stress through carefully calibrated psychological pressure during their sessions, combined with knowledge of her pre-existing condition. No evidence, no witnesses, no way to prove anything but natural causes. Mrs. Webb had taught him well, just not what she'd intended to teach. David made a note in his hidden journal. Methodology confirmed. Ready for larger applications. Outside his window, the Maryland forest stretched into darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, the future was taking shape. A future that would eventually spread far beyond this facility, beyond the CIA's control, beyond anyone's ability to stop. Project Mockingbird had succeeded in creating exactly what it intended. The tragedy was that success and catastrophe were the same thing. The first indication that David Rosewood had become something unprecedented came in the autumn of 1956, 3 years into his residency at the facility. Catherine Ross was found in her dormitory room, conscious but unresponsive, staring at the ceiling with pupils dilated to twice normal size. Medical examination revealed no physical trauma, no evidence of drug administration, no physiological explanation for her condition. She remained catatonic for 17 hours before gradually regaining normal function. When Dr. Marsh interviewed her 2 days later, Catherine refused to discuss what had happened. The only statement she would make, repeated verbatim each time the question was asked, was that she had decided to withdraw from certain activities that no longer interested her. The change in Catherine was absolute. The girl who had dominated the facility's social hierarchy for 3 years became almost invisible. She stopped participating in advanced seminars. She completed assigned tasks with mechanical precision but showed no initiative. Most significantly, she avoided David Rosewood with obvious deliberation, leaving any room he entered, refusing to make eye contact if they passed in hallways. Colonel Whitmore recognized the pattern. He had seen it before in interrogation subjects who had been broken so thoroughly that their personalities fundamentally restructured around the trauma. Whatever David had done to Catherine had achieved in hours what professional interrogators sometimes failed to accomplish in months. Whitmore called David to his office on a cold November morning. The boy was 13 now, taller but still slight, with the same pale gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they observed. The colonel asked directly what had happened with Catherine. David's response was characteristically precise. Catherine had attempted to establish dominance over him through psychological manipulation, he explained. She had been conducting a campaign of subtle intimidation for several months. Small acts designed to demonstrate her superior understanding of human behavior and his vulnerability to techniques he had not yet mastered. He had allowed this to continue until he had fully mapped her psychological architecture. Then he had demonstrated that her understanding of manipulation was shallow compared to what was actually possible. Whitmore asked what specifically David had done. David explained that he had identified Catherine's core psychological structure, the framework of beliefs and fears that organized her personality. Over the course of a single evening conversation, he had systematically deconstructed that framework, revealing to Catherine that everything she believed about herself was performance rather than substance. He had shown her, with precise psychological pressure, that the identity she had constructed was as artificial as the cover stories Mrs. Webb had taught them to create. The experience of having one's entire sense of self exposed as fiction, David said, was apparently quite destabilizing. Whitmore asked if David understood he had potentially caused permanent psychological damage. David said he understood that possibility. He also understood that Catherine would not report what had occurred, because doing so would require her to articulate the experience, which would necessitate re-experiencing the psychological dissolution. She would choose silent withdrawal over that alternative. The colonel studied David for a long moment. Then he asked a question that revealed how completely the situation had evolved beyond normal parameters. He asked whether David considered himself still subject to the program's authority, or whether he had decided that his continued cooperation was now voluntary. David appreciated the directness. He said that authority was a consensual fiction. It existed only so long as both parties agreed to maintain the pretense. He was willing to continue that pretense because the facility still offered resources and training he found valuable. But yes, his cooperation was now functionally voluntary, because any attempt to compel obedience would simply accelerate his departure. Whitmore made no immediate response. Finally, he said that the program had reached a decision point. David could continue his training under modified parameters that acknowledged the reality of the situation, or arrangements could be made for his transfer to a different type of facility, one focused on containment rather than development. David asked what the modified parameters would entail. Access to advanced training previously restricted to adult operatives, Whitmore said. Operational deployment in controlled scenarios. Gradual transition toward the role David would eventually occupy regardless of the program's preferences. In exchange, David would refrain from further experimentation on facility personnel or residents. Psychological manipulation for training purposes would be tolerated, but not actions that caused lasting damage or compromised operational security. David considered this for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he agreed. The arrangement was never formalized in writing. No documentation existed in Project Mockingbird's files acknowledging that a 13-year-old had effectively negotiated terms with CIA Operational Command. But from November 1956 forward, David Rosewood's status at the facility changed in ways that troubled everyone who understood what was happening. Dr. Eleanor Marsh watched the transformation with growing alarm. Her journal entries from this period documented observations she could not include in official reports. December 3, 1956. David now attends strategy sessions with adult case officers. He contributes analysis that experienced operatives find valuable. They have begun forgetting he is 13, or perhaps they simply no longer care. January 17, 1957. Subject demonstrates capability to construct psychological profiles more accurate than formal assessments. He identified a security officer's undisclosed gambling problem through 3 brief conversations. When confronted, Officer confirmed accuracy and requested transfer rather than continue working where David could observe him. March 22, 1957. The other children now avoid David entirely. Even Thomas Chen, who shows no fear response to anything, keeps maximum distance. They recognize a predator of different magnitude than themselves. The operational deployment Whitmore had mentioned began in spring 1957. David was inserted into scenarios designed to test his capabilities in controlled conditions. The operations were minor, gathering information from diplomatic receptions, assessing the reliability of potential recruits, conducting what the CIA termed social engineering against low-level targets. David performed flawlessly. More troublingly, he began improvising beyond his operational parameters, achieving objectives that had not been specified in his briefings. A mission to assess a State Department employee's susceptibility to recruitment ended with the target voluntarily providing classified information David had not been instructed to obtain. An assignment to observe a foreign diplomat's social circle resulted in the diplomat requesting a private meeting where he offered to provide intelligence to American handlers. The after-action reports grew increasingly uncomfortable. David was not simply completing assigned tasks, he was identifying and exploiting opportunities that experienced case officers had not recognized existed. His capability was exceeding the program's ability to properly supervise his activities. In June 1957, Whitmore suspended David's operational deployments pending comprehensive review. The decision came after an incident in Georgetown where David, assigned to observe a Soviet cultural attaché, had somehow maneuvered the attaché into a position where the man could be photographed accepting what appeared to be payment from a known intelligence operative. The photograph was valuable. It gave CIA leverage over the attaché for future recruitment. But David had created the entire scenario without authorization, manipulating both the attaché and the intelligence operative into positions that served David's assessment of what would be strategically useful. When Whitmore demanded explanation, David's response was simple. The mission parameters had been vague, so he had exercised initiative to achieve what he understood to be the underlying objective. Gathering information about the attaché was less valuable than creating circumstances that made the attaché vulnerable to pressure. He had prioritized strategic value over literal compliance with instructions. Whitmore recognized the problem immediately. David was no longer following orders. He was interpreting broad strategic goals and pursuing them through methods he selected independently. This made him simultaneously more valuable and less controllable than any asset the program had developed. The suspension was framed as routine evaluation, but everyone involved understood the reality. The program had created an operative it could not reliably direct, who was still legally a child, and who showed no indication that adult authority would ever genuinely constrain his decision-making. Dr. Marsh used the suspension period to conduct her most comprehensive assessment of David's psychological state. The evaluation lasted 3 weeks and involved testing protocols that would not be formally developed for another decade. Her conclusions were presented in a classified report submitted directly to CIA's Office of Medical Services. Subject displays complete absence of normal empathetic response. Relationships are understood purely as transactional, assessed for utility rather than emotional content. Subject shows no physiological stress response when lying. No genuine emotional attachment to any individual, no internalized moral constraints beyond strategic calculation of consequences. Most significantly, subject demonstrates metacognitive awareness of his own psychological makeup that exceeds clinical norms. He understands that his internal experience differs from neurotypical individuals and has developed sophisticated compensatory mechanisms. He does not simply lack empathy. He has systematically studied empathetic responses in others and can simulate them with precision that defeats standard psychological assessment. Traditional evaluation metrics are inadequate for this subject. He is not a child who might develop normal emotional capacity with proper intervention. He is a fully formed personality, organized around principles fundamentally incompatible with conventional morality or social cooperation. Recommendation: Subject should not be deployed operationally, regardless of demonstrated capability. The absence of normal psychological constraints means his actions cannot be predicted or controlled through standard handler-asset relationship. Continued training only increases the threat he will eventually pose. The report was filed on August 12, 1957. 3 weeks later, Dr. Marsh received formal notification that her contract with Project Mockingbird was being terminated. Her services were no longer required. All documentation related to her work would remain classified. She was to have no further contact with program personnel or facilities. The termination was professionally phrased, but the message was clear. Her recommendations were being rejected, and her presence had become inconvenient. Dr. Marsh cleaned out her office and returned to Georgetown University. She never learned whether her report influenced any decisions about David Rosewood. The program's classification protocols ensured she would have no access to information about what happened after her departure. But she continued her private journal, documenting observations and theories about what David might become. The entries grew increasingly dark as months passed. November 1957. Intelligence services throughout history have employed individuals with antisocial characteristics: assassins, saboteurs, agents provocateurs. But these were always adults who had developed their capabilities independently before recruitment. David is different. He has been systematically trained since childhood by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world. We have created something without historical precedent. February 1958. I find myself wondering whether David views his relationship with CIA as anything beyond temporary convenience. He cooperates because the program provides resources. What happens when he decides he has extracted all available value? What prevents him from simply disappearing and applying his training to purposes we cannot anticipate? June 1958. The fundamental error was assuming we were training an asset. We were actually educating a predator in techniques for hunting human prey more effectively. Every skill we taught him, deception, manipulation, psychological destruction, has made him more dangerous. And we have no framework for containing what we created. The end came on January 8, 1959. David was 16, legally still a minor, but physically and psychologically mature beyond his years. He had been at the facility for 6 years, longer than any other resident in Mockingbird's history. Plans were being developed for his transition to adult operational status: cover identity, permanent assignment, full integration into CIA's clandestine service. The training exercise that day was routine. Practice maintaining cover identity during extended interaction with unknowing civilians. David was to spend the afternoon at a Georgetown cafe, assuming the role of a high school student, engaging in normal conversation with whatever targets of opportunity presented themselves. He left the facility at 0900 in a staff vehicle. The driver dropped him at the corner of Wisconsin and M Street with instructions to return to the same location at 1700 for extraction. David never appeared for pickup. Initial response was measured. Teenagers sometimes lost track of time, got distracted, made innocent errors. But by 1900, when David had not returned to the facility and could not be located at the cafe or anywhere in the surrounding area, the situation escalated. By midnight, every CIA resource in the Washington area was searching for him. By dawn, the search had expanded to include FBI cooperation, though the Bureau was given minimal information about who they were looking for or why. David Rosewood had vanished. The investigation that followed would eventually consume thousands of man-hours and produce a file running to more than 800 pages. The conclusions were devastating. David had been planning his departure for years, possibly since his first months at the facility. He had systematically created false identities using information gathered during his training. He had established financial resources by manipulating program personnel into providing access to discretionary funds. He had developed contacts throughout the intelligence community who believed they were cultivating him as an asset when he had actually been cultivating them as future resources. Most damning, he had left behind a message. Not a physical note, but something more disturbing. The day after David's disappearance, 3 separate incidents occurred across Washington. A State Department official confessed to his wife that he had been providing classified information to an unidentified handler for 2 years. A congressional aide attempted suicide, leaving a note describing blackmail pressure he could no longer withstand. A CIA case officer requested immediate psychiatric evaluation, claiming he had been systematically manipulated by one of the agency's own training subjects. All 3 men described interactions with a teenage boy who had asked seemingly innocent questions, engaged in friendly conversation, and somehow extracted information or created leverage that left them completely compromised. The incidents were David's calling card, a demonstration that he had been conducting unauthorized operations for years while ostensibly under close supervision. He had identified targets, exploited them successfully, and maintained these operations invisible to program oversight. The message was clear. Project Mockingbird had never actually controlled David Rosewood. They had simply provided him with training and resources while he pursued his own agenda. Colonel Whitmore's final report on the incident was brutally honest. Subject's disappearance represents complete operational failure. Review of facility records suggests subject was never genuinely compliant with program authority. His cooperation was strategic performance designed to maximize access to training while maintaining freedom to pursue independent objectives. Subject has demonstrated capability to construct and maintain multiple cover identities, manipulate trained intelligence personnel without detection, conduct complex operations requiring years of planning, disappear from surveillance by sophisticated security apparatus. Most concerning, we have no insight into subject's actual goals or long-term intentions. 6 years of close observation produced no reliable intelligence about his genuine motivations. Everything we believed we understood about subject may have been deliberately cultivated misdirection. Recommendation: classifies subject as severe threat to national security. Assume he will use training against American interests. Assume he has capabilities we have not yet identified. Assume previous assessments of his limitations were inaccurate. The official story, circulated through intelligence channels, was that David Rosewood had defected to the Soviet Union. The narrative was plausible. A CIA-trained teenager recruited by KGB would represent significant coup for Soviet intelligence. The story also conveniently explained how someone with David's training had managed to disappear so completely. But Whitmore's classified assessment, shared only with CIA's highest leadership, was different. Subject has not defected. He has simply graduated. We trained him to be invisible and manipulative. We should not be surprised that he has applied those skills to escaping our control. The question is not where he has gone, but what he intends to do with the capabilities we provided. The years following David's disappearance became known within certain CIA circles as the Shadow Period. Reports filtered in from stations worldwide describing encounters with individuals who matched David's description but operated under different identities. Berlin, 1959. An American teenager working as translator demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of intelligence tradecraft. Disappeared before he could be properly interviewed. Moscow, 1960. A young exchange student appeared at diplomatic functions with improbable frequency. Subsequent investigation found no record of his enrollment at any Soviet university. Prague, 1961. A courier in his late teens facilitated communication between Western diplomats and Czech dissidents. Vanished when CIA attempted recruitment. Each sighting was investigated. Each proved impossible to verify. The individuals described would disappear before identification, or turn out to be genuine civilians with documented backgrounds, or simply cease to exist as if they had never been there. The pattern suggested David had mastered the techniques Mockingbird had taught him and developed them beyond the program's original scope. He was not simply maintaining a single cover identity, but apparently operating multiple personas simultaneously across different geographical regions. More disturbing were the deaths. Between 1959 and 1962, 17 individuals with connections to Project Mockingbird died from apparent natural causes or accidents. The victims included former instructors, security personnel, administrative staff, and 2 CIA officers who had supervised David's operational deployments. Statistical analysis suggested the pattern was not coincidental, but autopsies revealed nothing suspicious. The deaths matched David's suspected methodology, exploiting pre-existing medical conditions or engineering circumstances that produced fatal accidents indistinguishable from random misfortune. Dr. Eleanor Marsh was not among the victims, which troubled her more than if she had been targeted. David's decision to spare her suggested he maintained some form of relationship with her, perhaps professional respect, perhaps strategic calculation that her survival served purposes she could not identify. In September 1962, she received an envelope postmarked from Mexico City. No return address, no identifying marks. Inside was a single typed page. Dear Dr. Marsh, thank you for your years of study and documentation. You understood what I was before anyone else did, and you tried to warn them. They didn't listen because they saw a tool they could use rather than a threat they should contain. You were right to be afraid. I am everything you suspected and more. The training they provided has been invaluable, not for serving their purposes, but for pursuing my own. You spent 7 years trying to understand what I am. Perhaps you'll spend the rest of your life trying to understand what I've become. You also tried to help me, in your way. You advocated for my removal from the program when you recognized the danger. That effort, though unsuccessful, demonstrated something resembling genuine concern for outcomes beyond your professional obligations. I have no capacity for gratitude in the emotional sense you would understand, but I recognize the strategic value of not eliminating individuals who might provide useful perspective in the future. You will not be harmed. Consider this professional courtesy between researchers. With sincere respect for your intellectual honesty, Dr. The letter was analyzed by CIA Technical Services. No fingerprints, no DNA, no traceable characteristics. The typewriter was never identified. Mexico City Station found no evidence David had been in the city. Dr. Marsh kept the letter in her private papers. She never reported it to authorities. The decision was partly fear. Demonstrating continued contact with David might make her a target. But partly, she admitted in her journal, it was relief. The letter confirmed he would not kill her, which meant she could continue her work without that particular terror. Her final journal entry, written in March 1989, 3 months before her death from cancer, reflected on the question that had consumed her final decades. I have spent 30 years trying to understand what David Rosewood became after leaving Mockingbird. The evidence suggests he did not align with any existing intelligence service or criminal organization. He appears to operate as an independent entity, pursuing objectives I cannot decipher. The deaths connected to him show pattern but no clear motive beyond eliminating those who might identify or contain him. The sightings suggest capability to maintain multiple identities across continents. The absence of any verified photograph or reliable description since 1959 suggests he has achieved near-complete invisibility. We created him, we trained him, we lost him, and now he exists somewhere in the world. A predator with skills no human being should possess, pursuing goals we cannot comprehend. The Rosewood file remains open not because we hope to find him, but because we fear what will happen if he decides to find us. My final assessment. David Rosewood represents what happens when we apply scientific methodology to creating human weapons without fully understanding the implications. We succeeded in developing something unprecedented. We failed to recognize that success and catastrophe were the same outcome. If there is a God, and if he possesses any mercy, David Rosewood will die young from accident or disease before he reaches his full potential. Because a David Rosewood at 40 or 50, with decades of experience applying his capabilities to purposes we cannot imagine, would represent a threat no society has adequate defenses against. I pray I am wrong, but I fear I am not. The CIA officially closed active investigation of David Rosewood in 1975. The conclusion, documented in classified files, stated that the subject had likely died years earlier, possibly eliminated by hostile intelligence services after his usefulness ended, possibly from accident or natural causes. The assessment was almost certainly false, but maintaining an active investigation into a subject who had evaded detection for 16 years served no productive purpose. Better to classify the case as resolved and focus resources on current threats. Project Mockingbird itself was terminated in 1973. Its records destroyed during CIA headquarters reorganization. The official reason was routine declassification review. The actual reason was institutional desire to bury evidence of a program that had violated numerous ethical guidelines and produced an asset-turned-threat that the agency had no framework for containing. Only 3 complete sets of documentation survived. Dr. Marsh's private papers, sealed until her death and donated to undisclosed archive. Colonel Whitmore's classified reports, buried in CIA's restricted files, and the memories of aging intelligence officers who sometimes wondered whether certain unexplained events might trace back to a boy who disappeared from Georgetown in 1959. In the decades following the shadow period, occasional incidents suggested David Rosewood's continued existence. A financier in Geneva died under suspicious circumstances after reportedly meeting with an American consultant who perfectly manipulated a complex negotiation. A diplomatic crisis in Bangkok resolved through intermediary who appeared from nowhere and vanished immediately after successful mediation. A series of deaths in the pharmaceutical industry that benefited competitors in patterns suggesting deliberate market manipulation. None could be definitively connected to David. But the sophistication of the operations, the psychological precision of the manipulations, and the complete absence of traceable evidence matched his suspected methodology. The most disturbing theory, proposed by a CIA analyst in 1987 and immediately classified, suggested that David had not pursued any single objective, but had instead spent decades conducting experiments in applied psychology on global scale. Testing techniques, refining methodologies, exploring the limits of what could be accomplished through pure manipulation without physical coercion. If the theory was accurate, then David Rosewood had transformed the entire world into his laboratory. Every interaction, every operation, every death was data point in research project whose ultimate goals remained invisible. The analyst who proposed this theory requested transfer to different division immediately after submitting his assessment. In his private notes, he wrote, "If Rosewood is still alive and still operating, then we are all living in an environment he is actively shaping for purposes we cannot comprehend. The implications are too disturbing to contemplate while maintaining professional functionality." On a cold evening in November 2022, a researcher at the National Archives discovered recently declassified files related to Project Mockingbird. The documents had been sealed for 50 years, their existence unknown to anyone outside the most restricted intelligence circles. The researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, spent 6 months reviewing the material. Her analysis, published in the Journal of Intelligence History, created minor sensation in academic circles specializing in Cold War operations. But one aspect of her research troubled Dr. Chen enough that she did not include it in her published work. She had attempted to track what happened to the children who participated in Project Mockingbird after the program's termination. Of the 13 children documented in the files, she found records for 11. 3 had died young, suicide, accident, overdose. 5 had struggled with severe psychological problems throughout their lives. 2 had achieved apparent normalcy, building careers and families that showed no obvious signs of their unusual childhood. 1 had simply disappeared. No death certificate, no subsequent records, no evidence that David Rosewood had existed after January 1959. Dr. Chen expanded her search, looking for anyone matching his description in the decades following his disappearance. She found nothing. It was as if he had become invisible, or perhaps had never existed at all. Late one night, while reviewing her research notes, Dr. Chen received an email from an address she did not recognize. The message contained no text, only an attachment, a scanned image of a typed letter dated September 1962. She recognized it immediately. Dr. Marsh's letter from David Rosewood, the one described in the declassified files but never recovered from Marsh's private papers. The email appeared to be sent from Mexico City. When Dr. Chen attempted to trace the sender, she found the account had been created minutes before the email was sent and deleted immediately afterward. The IP address traced to a public library in Mexico City, but surveillance footage from the relevant time showed no one using the computer from which the email originated. Dr. Chen stared at the letter for a long time. Then she deleted her entire research folder on David Rosewood, removed all related files from her computer, and decided to pursue other historical topics. She never publicly explained why she abandoned what had been a promising research project, but her private notes, discovered after her retirement, contained a single entry dated the day she received the mysterious email. Some questions should not be answered. Some stories should not be told. Some individuals should remain invisible. If David Rosewood is still alive, he is now 79 years old. Nearly 60 years of applying the world's most sophisticated intelligence training to purposes we cannot imagine. 60 years of practicing manipulation, deception, and psychological destruction without constraint or oversight. I do not want to know what such a person has become. I do not want him to know that I'm asking questions about him. I do not want to learn whether the email I received was coincidence or warning. The Rosewood file should remain closed, not because the story is unimportant, but because some stories are too dangerous to tell. The file on David Rosewood remains sealed in CIA archives. The access restrictions state that the material will be reviewed for declassification in 2059, 100 years after his disappearance. By then, if he still lives, David Rosewood will be 116 years old. The statistical probability of that is effectively zero. But then, statistical probability has never been a reliable guide to understanding David Rosewood. Somewhere in the world, a man who should not exist may still be conducting experiments, still refining techniques, still treating human society as laboratory for research that serves purposes no one else can comprehend. Or perhaps he died decades ago, and all the suspicious patterns, all the unexplained incidents, all the moments that seemed to bear his methodology were simply coincidence compounded by paranoia. The truth, like David Rosewood himself, remains invisible, and perhaps that is exactly how he wants it.